Hello, everybody. I am joined by some fantastic individuals from Firelock Games. We've got Mike, we've got Liam, and we've got Joseph. And we're going to be talking about some awesome Blood and Plunder epicness that is out there in the wild for everyone to dive into. So, Fire on the Frontier. It's an awesome sort of supplement and expansion for Blood and Plunder that everyone can get their teeth into. But before we actually dive into all of that, I just want everyone to introduce themselves and talk about themselves so everyone gets to know you. So we'll start with you, Mike. Go for it.
All right. So Mike Tunez here. I'm lead game developer, studio manager, and man of many hats at Firelock Games. Mm-hmm. And pretty much all there is to that.
Yeah. Joseph, you want to tell us about yourself as well?
I'm Joseph Forster. I live out here in Oregon, West Coast. I just got recently sucked into helping out with development with Firelock.
Tricked into it is a better way to put it.
Privileged to be part of it. I backed the first Kickstarter and was a pretty active player and community member and started a blog on it. And then I think Liam was one of the guys who kind of sucked me in, and then I've been
okay. So it's Liam's fault, yeah.
Contribute. And this is the first project that I was able to contribute that's been launched. So
stuff.
It's kind of like a pyramid scheme. I got Liam in, and then Liam gets Joseph.
I see how it works. I see how it works now. Yeah.
All right, it's my turn to sucker some people in now. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, you've done so already.
Okay.
And Liam as well, if you could introduce yourself and tell us what you've done in the book as well.
I'm Liam, and I'm from the UK, so I'm here with you. And I'm the house punch bag, as you probably figured out. Right. I just get blamed for everything that goes wrong. That's my job.
Sure.
Cool. Yeah. So, yes, now we've got the introductions out of the way. Fire on the Frontier, as I was mentioning. Can you guys give me a round of exactly what this is all about? What can people expect when they pick up Fire on the Frontier?
All right, it's a good question for Joseph, I think.
Go for it.
Me?
Joseph.
Yeah.
Fire on the Frontier focuses on two late 17th century wars in North America. King Philip's War, which is tribes of New England fighting the New Englanders, mostly Massachusetts, Rhode Island. And then King William's War as well, which is a larger, more sprawling conflict. This book gives you new or updated factions from the No Peace Beyond the Line book that kind of zeroes in on the details for these two conflicts. So you have new factions for the French, English, and Native Americans. A lot of new characters at this level. We're able to add a lot of the notable and interesting commanders, characters, and unique members of forces. So that's real fun. And then it has some scenarios, historical scenarios representing specific battles, and some generic scenarios representing some of the common engagements. And then new to the game as well is a good chapter on fortifications. The core book has some fortifications. This expands that a lot. And then we can't forget, as we're seeing in front of us, the excellent work Liam did on the historical introduction.
Mm-hmm.
That's right.
Yeah. So that was one of the things that I was really interested in when I first sort of got my hands on the book, was that sort of like slew of historical information that you guys kind of preface everything with. What was it like sort of diving back into that period and picking and choosing exactly what you wanted to use for Fire on the Frontier? Was it an easy choice to sort of go for these two wars, or were you kind of pulled in different directions when it came to this?
I'll let Liam take that.
Yeah, Liam, if you want to. Yeah.
Well, I suppose the background, just to go into it a little bit, was No Peace Beyond the Line, which was the previous major expansion for Blood and Plunder, which covered the late 17th century and included quite a lot of Native American factions, but kind of really did a deep dive on the Caribbean natives and a little bit of a less of a deep dive on the North Americans. And so the original kind of plan was, I think Joseph and I got together and said, we should really update the Native American factions. So we updated them and showed them to Mike. And he said that, expecting it to be released as a kind of an update or an errata or a PDF. And Mike said, that's great, but what I really want you guys to do is to turn it into a book. and just focus on the late 17th century. And so, the obvious choice then was to look at King Philip's War and King William's Wars, which really dominate that period. And they're a fascinating period of evolution and development, I think, in the sort of the way that colonial New England was evolving and developing. And of course, King William's War is the first of what became the French and Indian Wars. So it's interesting, and it's slightly off-piste from what people probably usually associate with French and Indian stuff.
I was going to say as well, I guess from a lot of people who have played Blood and Plunder already, I mean, obviously we've seen things move on and stuff when it comes to the timeline and that kind of stuff. But this moving ahead into a lot of, I guess, land-based scenarios, I suppose would be the best way to put it, sort of takes things in a different direction and allows you to play games in a different sense as well. What was one of the interest? Well, let's start with the King Philip's War. So, what was some of the cool stuff that you wanted to pull out of that, and then throw at people as war gamers? What were some of the elements there? Whoever wants to answer the question.
Well, there was a lot of stuff there. So, King Philip's War. When we did No Peace Beyond the Line, hands out of the screen. When we did No Peace Beyond the Line, King Philip's War was one thing that kind of made me think, all right, we need to kind of cover the North American theater a little bit, because it's all interconnected anyway, and it's just so fascinating. There's a lot of, I mean, it was a pretty significant conflict for the period, and especially for the setting. It totally encompassed the entire colonial frontier in that region for so long, and it's kind of the beginning of the whole thing with the French and Indian Wars, and all the things that kind of played themselves up to the American Revolution. And I found that history and that setting just totally fascinating, as Europeans adapt to Native American style warfare. Native Americans are inversely doing the same. And there's just the style of the engagements just lends itself so well to skirmish games of this size that we do in Blood and Plunder. And it just adds, it's such a different sort of battle than you get for your typical like Buccaneers raiding Spanish settlements and things like that. But I'll let the other guys kind of poke at what they like about it.
Yeah, sure. So Joseph, so what was some of the elements of that sort of King Philip's Wars period that sort of you were engaged with when it came to the game?
Like you said, focus on land engagements is kind of it's always been in Blood and Plunder, but to focus on that and focus on some of the different tactics they use on land. Some of that is in No Peace Beyond the Line, but this focuses on that a lot more. You got more slippery Indians, and they can hide better. And you got English who are struggling to figure out how to fight against that, and starting to learn and appreciate the natives' tactics and employ natives against natives. Also, just a complex political situation is really fun to dive into and try to figure out. There's a lot going on there. The Indians and the English were quite integrated, almost more integrated than you'll ever see before or after, at least in an English setting. But then it all went badly.
And so, Liam, the other thing I was interested in was the pulling together all those different characters that you then see brought to life in the rules. Was it, I'm guessing it must have been quite interesting trying to pick and choose who you would want to represent, or was it very much a case of just looking at key battles and moments and being like, we definitely need to have this person in, et cetera, et cetera?
That was something that Joseph and I worked on together quite a lot. And no, it wasn't so much key, I mean, obviously the key events, you want the characters that are mentioned in the history, but finding detail on some of these characters was quite challenging.
I can imagine.
Some of the more obscure Native American tribes, particularly, it was challenging finding some of the information about those. I think Joseph did an awful lot of the research on some of those characters, and we very much worked together, and we had to whittle them down because we had far more than made the cut.
I was very ambitious.
It was
yes.
Cut back.
I had to say no to a lot of fun things, unfortunately.
Oh, what were some of the fun things that you said no to then? I want to know if there were any favorite, like little tiny gems that you were like, oh, I wish we could have included that. What was out there?
Well, that's definitely. So just to make it, I should clarify up front that I had very little to do with this project other than kind of just reviewing it and looking at his
right.
I was deep in the weeds
Yeah.
on our Kickstarter stuff in the time. So it was very convenient that Joseph and Liam wanted to work on this at that time. So, but I'll let them pick the ones that the heartbreaking cuts they had to make.
Yes, please tell me. Yeah.
Biggest thing I wish we could have got in there is there are several female sachems, leaders of native tribes. That would have been really fun to get in there, but I hate to say it, but they didn't quite feature prominently enough in the history or lead really any battles or anything. And we don't have any models for them either, but that would have been really fun. Yeah. It's unusual and it's kind of spotlighted here. There's 2 or 3 that were notable.
Having to make another model would have been a little too much, unfortunately. But
what about you, Liam?
Something we can look for in the future.
Yeah. What about you, Liam? Was there one that was sort of like, I wish that had got through into the final book?
No, not really. I mean, it's hard cutting back when you write a section of history like the introduction to that book. It's difficult to know how much to include and how much to cut out. You don't want to put too much in that it just becomes a boring slog to read. So hopefully we've drawn a balance. A lot of stuff did get cut back on, but I think probably for the best. And although I didn't feel that way at the time, you obviously didn't feel grumpy about it when that happened. But I think it was for the best. I mean, the key for me that in designing with Joe the Native American factions and working on the background history and things was really to put enough in there to give people a really good flavor of what those Native American tribes were really like, and to do them justice. They weren't hideous savages that from early 19th century or 20th century fiction, nor were they some kind of noble savages cruelly being suppressed by the English the whole time. They had real agency, and they're a fascinating group, and their politics is complicated, their way of war is complicated, and to put enough in, I think, that gives enough of that flavor, both in the rules and in the background, was the goal.
So for those people that are coming to the game and wanting to play the majority of their time as the Native Americans, what can people expect from them from sort of like a gameplay standpoint? You've obviously talked about the idea that they've got, these very interesting tactics and things, and they could be stealthy and stuff. But what else is there in there that people can sort of hook onto and be like, this is why I should play Native Americans?
Yeah, so I'll let these guys touch on, but in my experience, I've played with them quite a bit. And the biggest thing is that they're tough to pin down. A lot of the list tends to be pretty elite because these Blood and Plunder skirmish sized games tend to be where these types of conflicts tend to be where they shine. That was like their specialty in warfare, right? So they're very slippery. They're hard to pin down. They're you try to charge them and they just run back, and they come around and they hit you again, and it's they're a challenging faction to play against for newer players. A lot of newer players will have said things like that they're overpowered, too strong, but experienced players typically don't have any trouble with them because their big fault is typically numbers. They tend to have, since they're an elite force, they don't have as many models on the table, and once you kind of hit them hard, they tend to melt away. So they play totally different from the European factions. With the exception of some of the European factions that are a little more integrated, like you'll find in this book. So if you're kind of interested in both, there's some good options there as well. But what do you guys take away from that?
I think you should play the natives if you want to dramatically win or dramatically lose.
That sounds cool. That sounds good. Yeah.
So if you know what you're doing and dice don't betray you, you can sometimes smash someone on turn 2. You can hit with your ranged weapons hard and then run in and break heads, like they said, and then it's just shock and all. They just are done. They're dead. But if your charge doesn't make it, or if you get hit with a couple too many volleys or organized volleys, and your resolve isn't good, then you're just on your heels the whole time and you might get massacred yourself. It's kind of all or nothing, which is kind of fun.
kind of going with that idea of like
cool.
a finesse faction almost in that respect. So yeah, that's kind of cool.
Definitely. Yeah. What's interesting about that is that historical result, pretty much. That's kind of how it went in real life. So.
Yeah, they don't do well in a kind of an attrition fight.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a big. They need to get in and win quick.
Yeah,
they don't do well at a more attritive fight, and that is exactly how it went in real life.
Yeah, I guess in that sense, then I assume, like as you've already mentioned, like that this particular war, the King's Phillips War, and the kind of conflicts that were played out, seem like a perfect opportunity to introduce the Native American factions, because you get to dramatically see how that would work within those particular scenarios that definitely happened in real life. So yeah, that's really cool.
They did, and that's where Blood and Plunder is all Mike's baby. But the core rules, the core mechanics are such a good toolkit for expanding to this kind of thing, because you have enough in that toolkit that you can really play different tunes on it, and have these very different play styles between some of these factions, even very different play styles between some of the Native American factions. So there's a lot of depth there.
Very awesome.
Yeah, it's true.
Yeah,
and that's one thing I'd like to highlight real quick, if that's okay. We kind of touched on it a little bit, but in a lot of other historical games, the Native Americans have kind of just been like this overarching faction, and there's not. I mean, I can understand. I'm not criticizing anybody here, but it's hard. There's so much, like they've talked about. There's so much complexity to their culture and their way of doing things, and some of the similarities can get lost in translation. I mean, some of the differences.
Right.
So they kind of focus on the similarities and the common knowledge in most historical games that cover these sorts of conflicts. So it was really important to me and that's why this book is great, because we didn't cover it as much as I'd like in No Peace Beyond the Line, because it's just, I mean, that if you have that book, it's huge. I mean, that was a massive undertaking, so we really just couldn't do any more than we did. But I felt like it needed a little bit more. That's where this book came in. So, and it really does. You can play two different Native American factions that are under the same kind of umbrella regionally, but they have distinct differences, and they will play different.
Yeah. Well, I mean, when we were just flicking through the book just then, we could see that there's a fair amount of different options for people to play around with and have fun with, which is quite cool. So, yeah. So obviously that kind of gives us a little grounding in the King Philip's War and sort of how the Native Americans have been represented in the book. But you've also got the King William's War in the book. Liam, if you could kind of give us you obviously mentioned that it's kind of that sort of the powder keg almost for the French and Indian War and how that all sort of began. But if you give us a little bit more of a bit of background on kind of what's covered in the book for the King William's War.
I mean, both the French in Canada and the English out of New England and New York had been expanding and expanding and expanding. And eventually, inevitably almost, they were going to come into conflict.
Right.
So one of the first areas they came into conflict in was actually around Hudson's Bay and the Hudson's Bay Company. So there was actually fighting going on in North America before the true outbreak of King William's War, which is really a kind of an offshoot of the Glorious Revolution in England, and then the subsequent 9 Years' War against the French that follows on from that. So that's kind of the backdrop to it. There's just increasing rivalry between the French colonies and the English colonies over territory, over influence, and particularly over the fur trade. And that's sort of kicking things off behind the scenes. There's kind of a quasi war going on there for a while, as you can read about in the book. And then it just erupts into an all-out war, if you like, when England and France go to war in Europe. And it's the first time, I think, that the English and the French are really going at it in the way that they will go at it up until the fall of French Canada in 1756.
Yeah. So from a sort of gameplay perspective then, Joseph, what was it like trying to then represent what Liam's just told us about there? In terms of things like scenarios and stuff on the tabletop, was it an interesting sort of melting pot of ideas for you to play around with in that regard?
It was. One of the big things here is kind of the melding of the native and the European forces together. So we have French and Indians working really closely together in the same fighting unit, basically. So we have forces like the French raiders that can take natives and French, and they have some of the advantages of both and some of the weaknesses of both. The English didn't do that quite so much. They tried to just employ the Iroquois to buffer themselves.
Right. Yeah.
But then you have big expeditionary forces trying to go out and take the Canadian cities. So that's something different. Also, something I have to mention that Liam's going to love is the real centrality of some of the civilians in this conflict. The English frontier was on fire. So we, as a new faction, the New England Village Garrison, which is introduces, I think, all the pain and suffering that the just normal people suffered is worth representing. So there's this faction that's kind of laughably bad, but it plays totally different, and it has some fun characters and rules that I thought I was really thankful that Mike didn't make me cut it.
I guess that leads people. Yeah, I guess that leads into one of those things that I think is quite nice about this book and Blood and Plunder in general as well, is that you can play it competitively. But I think one of the nice things about it is the idea of jumping in and telling the stories of this time period, and including something that wouldn't necessarily be up to par with some of the greatest military might of the era. I think gives you an opportunity to collect something different and play around with it, which is kind of cool. Yeah. One of the other things, obviously, so this brings together the English and the French in a mighty conflict. What's sort of new in there for English and French players to play around with? Obviously, we talked a little bit about kind of bringing in the villagers and that kind of stuff that exist out there as the colonists things. But what about on the French side of things? Is there some special new stuff that they can play around with as well?
There's the Compagnie Franche de la Marine, which is these are colonial troops that are actually raised in France and become increasingly important through the history of French Canada. And they are dispatched to New France in quite significant numbers. And they're raised as regulars, these troops. But they very quickly adopt to the frontier way of life and the frontier way of war. So they kind of become almost like a prototype for light infantry. And they're represented in the book, and they add something really quite special for the French and quite unique, because they can add a sort of a certain stiffness to the coureurs de bois and the other units that people will already be probably familiar with from the other books. So that's the main thing that the French get. But their factions are also really quite integrated with the Native Americans. You'll find most of their factions can take Native Americans in the lists because they very much work together.
Oh, so that's got a nice sort of mix of things for you to play around with, which is quite cool. Yeah, that's nice. Joseph, are there any particular standout models, units, I guess, for either the English and the French that are kind of you're drawn to in particular? That sort of you're like, that's definitely something you should play around with when you're diving into the game.
Provincial.
The English have the provincial unit, which is not as professional as the French unit that Liam just mentioned, which I can't pronounce. But
that's why I jumped in.
Thank you for saving us there. So they have one new unit, this provincial. He's more professional than your English militia, but still not as good as the French, and that's represented in point cost and how they work. But that's a new good option for the English that gives them a little more backbone.
Very nice.
Again, this is a historical thing. These were essentially militia who were militia taken on for a period, a fixed period of time, a campaign or a fixed number of years. They got extra training. They tended to be the more able of the militia. So they're sort of they're hybrid regulars militia, if you like, and they start being raised at this time, and they're the ones who are forming the main part of any expeditionary forces that are being sent out by the English, and they remain increasingly important through the 18th century.
One of the characters that sort of leapt out of the page for me. Maybe it's because he has my name, is Benjamin Church, who obviously made a name for himself in the King Philip's War, but then obviously continued into the King William's War. Can you tell people a little bit more about Benjamin Church? Because he seems like quite an interesting character.
He is interesting because he's one of the guys who very, very early realizes that if you're going to take on particularly the Native Americans, wandering about in the woods in using formal regular British tactics, or the way the militia were trained as well, which was they were trained to fight in the traditional European style, was just a recipe for disaster. Frankly, they would fade away if you were in too much strength, and ambush you if you weren't. So it was a recipe for losing. Benjamin Church realized that if you could integrate the Native American way of war with English technology and English troops, then you would have a better chance of fighting the Indians on their own terms. And so he was essentially, we're talking about the origins of the first Rangers.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so that's what he's raising. And it's Benjamin Church who does that. He takes them out. The end of King Philip's War, and it's his unit that actually kills King Philip, which is important. And at that point, I think they're sort of 50-50. The actual troops themselves are 50-50 Native American and English working side by side, working in pairs. And then into King William's War, he raises more companies of Rangers, and the French and the Indians are raiding into New England, and he's probably one of the few guys who can actually hit them back in the same way.
He's
sorry, go on, Mike. Yeah.
No, I was going to say he kind of like encapsulates for the English what the French had already employing and doing, and I think they kind of figured that out. He was also later on pretty effective against French forces as well because of this thing. Go ahead.
So he's one of those characters that a lot of people could potentially look at sort of basing their armies around and having fun with, sort of building up the narrative around Church and maybe following his adventures throughout both of these periods effectively, which would be quite nice to do. Again, sort of touching on that sort of narrative element to playing the game, which is quite nice. Yeah.
Yeah,
but he even gets into Queen Anne's War.
Well, so you've got plenty of things to do with him.
Yeah,
and he's also quite nice because he's got the English troops, the frontier guys, but he's also working with Indians. So it's quite a nice way to collect models as well.
Yeah.
You can start with a few of each type and build your collections out from there.
So moving on from sort of the kind of forces that people can play around with to what the forces might be fighting over. So one of the nice things you've added in this book was a sort of expanded section and how to use fortifications in your games. Joseph and Mike, if you wanted to tell me a little bit more about sort of how that works in game and what people can do with that.
Yeah, so that's Joseph and Liam have had these rules worked up for a while. We're just pestering me constantly to get them out. So this is the perfect vessel to give them what they wanted. So I'll let them cover it.
Cool. Yeah. I get a sense that it was Liam and Joseph going, now this would be amazing. And you going, yes, let's just do that. Yeah.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, that's essentially how it went down.
Yeah. So Joseph, if you want to take us through some stuff on the fortifications.
Yeah, fortifications are kind of hard in competitive gaming to make balanced. In reality, often if you have a good fortification, you're going to win. It's just not easy to take those. So these are presented largely as a narrative and for fun option. The official rules say both players must agree to use fortifications, and if they don't agree, you can't use them.
Right. Yeah.
But here we have a blockhouse, a garrison house, which is kind of a scaled back blockhouse common in New England, palisade wall, which is very common throughout the New World and used for a long time, basic logs stuck in the ground. You have just a basic fortified house, gun emplacement. Some of these are not specific to this era. They were published and then we just by themselves, and like the stone tower fort. There were some stone fortifications up here, but this is just a good place to slide this into the game and to increase its cost because it was so good. But yeah, they're pretty deadly. you get to clear all cover away from your fortification. So if you plant one, then you have a kill zone around it, like they would do. It can be fairly challenging to take them, but there are some fun scenarios that specifically require the fortifications as well. So,
but it's kind of hard to imagine the frontier war without palisades, palisade walls, small forts, blockhouses, that kind of thing. It's kind of an iconic thing. So we really felt it had to be included.
Yeah, it's one of those things that I think comes to mind is sort of deep, dense woodland and then huge, frosty clearings with a fort stuck in the middle of it and people nervously looking out into the night or something. Yeah,
That's it.
Yeah. I guess it opens up the idea for playing sort of multiplayer stuff as well, because you could almost have it where a couple of players come together to then play against one person who controls it. So it opens up the idea of playing cooperative things and that kind of thing too, which is quite nice. Yeah.
It's also worth mentioning that it's both sides in these conflicts.
Right.
The Native Americans are fortifying their towns and villages as well. One of the biggest fights in King Philip's War is a thing called the Great Swamp Fight, which is a fortified town in the middle of a swamp, with the Indians as the defenders rather than as the attackers, which is kind of the other way around to how you would often think about it. But,
and interestingly, that takes us on to another of the elements that's part of this book, and we can see the Great Swamp Fight there, is you've got a nice selection of scenarios to play around with in this game as well, which is pretty cool. Was it again one of those things, Liam, of sort of looking at the history book and then working together with Joseph and Mike and everyone to be like, right, so how do we then represent that? Did you find some that were like, oh, this is too hard to do or something, or were most of them fairly easy to sort of translate over? What was the
mainly cutting? Again, it's cutting,
right?
Cutting out stuff, because you could have done so many.
Shooting down my hard work. That's what it was.
Joseph did most of the work on these scenarios, and he would sort of send them through to me, and I go, no, that's never going to work, and then he'd ignore me and make it. Then it would be perfect. So, I mean, it's great. Things like the Great Swamp Fight is actually a really good scenario, because you can see on that little map, there's a gap in the fortifications. They didn't finish their fortifications for one reason or another. Right, so you've got, inside these scenarios, there are things that are built in to help with the gameplay, but that also genuinely happened. So that's one of the nice things Joe's managed to weave the history into the gameplay.
Yeah.
This is the medium swamp fight. If you want the Great Swamp Fight, we're plotting a 10-player game of the Great Swamp Fight at Historicon.
Oh, very cool. Yeah, that would be awesome. Do you have a particular favorite scenario from the ones that you put together, Joseph, from here, or are all of them your babies?
I like the Siege of Pemaquid. I've been playing that Palisade Fort forever and ragging on Mike to release the rules for it. I've played so many games of it. It gets featured here with the Bastions. Right. Mike, Bastions, how those Bastions coming?
They're coming good, actually. I just priced them out, so they should be up in the next week. Hopefully, more or less. By the time this is up, they may be out. We'll see.
But this one's fun. It was over a day and night and day where the English hold up. French and Indians surrounded them, tried to climb up on a hill to get elevation advantage over the English. The English tried to retreat their civilians into the fort, and eventually they just had to surrender. But here you have the scenario goes into night and then back into day, so that's kind of novel.
Cool. I also saw that you guys had put in, you haven't completely gone away from the idea of naval warfare, because there is also the Battle of Hudson Bay in there as well, which is obviously nice to see. And people will have a chance to play around with their ships and stuff, which is
big ships.
And there are a couple of naval factions too. In fact, there's privateers. There's a New England privateers faction, which is actually my favorite in the book. And even the Native Americans have a faction that can take ships.
Oh, right, okay.
Which again is they can only take little ships, size 2 ones for the technical guys, but they did capture some small ships and even went as far as planning an assault using them on Boston.
Oh, wow.
Never came to anything, but they had a little flotilla going for a while there. So we thought, well, why not? That's how that happened. Let's give them to them.
Yeah.
So there's plenty of nice little things for people to play around with this scenarios. Maybe it'll give them some inspiration to do something to themselves and create interesting, games to play with their campaign group, for example, and that kind of thing. The other thing I quite liked about it is that I loved the illustrations of the game mat effectively, because there's so many times where I see scenarios and then I'm like, but I don't know where to put everything. Whereas I really like these because they kind of give you a guide as a hobbyist to be like, right, we should put a copse of trees here. We should definitely have buildings here. So it gives people a nice thing to collect towards, which is quite cool. Yeah.
Yeah, gotta shout out our graphic artist, Lillian Figueroa, on that one. She's obviously worked together with Joe on it. She did a great job.
Very patient.
That is amazing work. Cool. So, yes, we've kind of gone through the book. So we've got things for the King Philip's War. We've got the King William's War. We've got all the additional stuff in there for the Native Americans, the English and the French, crossing those two different periods as well. Got the new fortification rules and then all of those scenarios at the same time as well. For anyone who is maybe on the fence, even after this amazing conversation about diving in to pick up this book, what would you say is like the main thing that should draw them towards it to dive in and have a go with it?
So, man, for me, it's if you're into the history, it's hey, come here. Sorry, dog. Sorry, something. Apparently, I have a package. Sorry. Anyway, if you're into history, this is worth picking up just to get like a nice condensed version of the history of everything going on in this period and in this setting. I mean, that alone to me is a big draw. Liam's done an excellent job with that. And if you're a player of Blood Plunder, I mean, the scenarios I think are really excellent here. There's tons of stuff that just adds to the game. These are pretty different from the ones we've done previously. There's a couple of historical ones, which is not something we've ever had in a book before. So that's really good. And, it's always cool to just have more expanded factions and upgrades and things like that. That's just, it's pretty much, this is a slightly smaller book than what we've put out before. A lot more approachable. You don't have to spend, days reading through this. But it gives you all the same stuff we've done in previous books. So I think it's a kind of a must-have if you're a Blood and Plunder player or just interested in the history of this region and history.
What about you, Joseph? What's one of the things that's sort of drawn you towards diving in and playing around with this book?
Kind of the seed of the book was updating the natives and making the North Americans a little more unique. And I think if you enjoy Native American, especially the northern version, this is your book. This is gives them a lot of character and flavor. Also, and we have a lot of named characters. It was kind of hard to find enough named characters for some of the factions in the earlier 17th century in No Peace Beyond the Line, but you can get a lot of flavor and really, I feel, connected to these people through the unique commanders. So that's my favorite.
There definitely seems to be a lot of personalities built into the book that allow you, as we were talking about with Church, for example, just following through their stories and their narratives and having fun with that. And then, as we kind of talked about this off camera as well, sort of looking at things and then finding something to then lead you off into additional reading and stuff, so you can go off and explore different
Lots
areas
of additional reading. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. All the books. Yeah. So, what about you, Liam? What's one of the things that you think is a big, the thing that should draw people to Fire on the Frontier?
I think Joe and Mike have mentioned it. Mentioned the main things. I think fortifications are a big draw because you can use those fortification rules out of time period, different places. They work just as well for the Caribbean and the pirates as they do for North America. We will probably add more fortification types in the future because we've concentrated on those that are in North America. But the basic mechanics, you can use them wherever. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one thing. I mean, for me, the thing I enjoy about the book is and the time period is this is the sort of the beginnings, what I would say is the emergence of an American identity, particularly amongst the North Americans and the New Englanders. Yeah. And my favorite faction is the New England Privateers. These guys are kind of existing on the fringes of legality. They're kind of making up their own rules to an extent. And this is the first time this is starting to happen. I'm not saying these are the first, this is the beginnings of the American Revolution or anything like that. That's ridiculous. But that there is an emerging sense of something American coming out
that
here.
bead almost. Yeah.
Yeah, and that we're giving that some flavor, and that we're putting little rules in that you might not spot at first, but as sort of subtle nods to that idea. So in the New England privateers, you can take an officer who's a bit better than a normal officer, who's kind of like, maybe he's been a pirate. Maybe he's been round the Red Sea, because a lot of them had. And maybe now he's working under a pseudonym, because a lot of them did. And maybe he's doing this kind of stuff. And maybe he's doing that. And, all through that period, the New Englanders and the Americans, and particularly New Yorkers, were starting to sort of think about themselves as English, but with their own interests. And I like the way that's portrayed in the book.
Very cool indeed.
Yeah, that's very good point, actually. That is that is something that we talked about that quite a bit when we were on the tail end of the development of it. And that's definitely comes through, and it's really interesting a little bit.
Very nice. Very cool indeed. So plenty of ways for people to dive in and have fun with Fire on the Frontier. I'm just going to throw a little bit of a curveball into the conversation as well now. So maybe some of you have some ideas that you want to share about this. So is there anything juicy you can share of what's happening next for Blood and Plunder? Maybe new models, new books, going off in different time periods. Maybe what's on the horizon? If you can share.
Of course they can. So Joseph is. We've got Joseph currently working on another book in this style, and there's some discussion as to exactly how that's going to go down. But the main thrust of it is that it's going to be focused on Florida during kind of this period, right? So there's a lot going on. Florida's kind of an interesting place between the 1630s, I think, right? Maybe 40s, I think. I don't remember exactly where we're starting it out, but where we finish it is kind of in the air right now. But there's, and since the Spanish didn't really feature in Fire on the Frontier, we're going to give them some attention and go in that direction. Neither did the Buccaneers or anything else. So we're going to get a lot more of that stuff in that book. Outside of that, we've got a lot of stuff coming. I was talking on a podcast yesterday with Craig from the D6 generation, and we brought up that we've invested in some new equipment, and we're going to start converting our line over to a new kind of nice plastic resin product, and that's going to allow us to bring prices down considerably and to expand and do a lot more things going forward. So more regular releases as opposed to big Kickstarters like we've done in the past, kind of where the direction that we're moving into. We've got a few other things. A smaller scale game in this setting is something that we've now started plotting and putting together.
Nice.
So kind of more of a mass battle thing, but with smaller scale figures. Focused on the land engagements of the Buccaneers, the big battles like Panama and things like that. So that's an exciting thing that's coming. And we've got a title. We actually have a title for that one already. It's called Morgan's Men. So it won't just be about Morgan, but he's the star of that one. Yeah. We've obviously got Blood and Steel about to come out. You guys have just reviewed Edgar and Damien on that one. So that's our Victorian era book. It's on pre-order right now. So if you're interested in Victorian era skirmishes, go check that out. It's a lot of fun. I've been playing it quite a bit, helping them testing the last bits, and it's in layout now, so it should be out pretty soon. We've got Philip. I'll tell you just to make sure I don't miss anything important.
There's so much stuff.
Okay. It looks like I got all the important bits. Okay, good. All right, so there's that.
Closer to home, there's some new minis still coming out for this.
Yes, I was about to get to that. So along with our new the new material, we're going to be making some miniatures, and there's quite a few models that we've had done. So we have models that are out right now for Fire on the Frontier, as you've seen, and those are some higher end 3D printed stuff that we've done in resin, and the models are really nice, but the process is just too slow, too tedious. So we're going to be moving it over to that new plastic resin system. So there's a bunch of models that were supposed to come out as 3D prints, but we're going to hold off. They're going to come out in that regard. We have the bastions, of course, for our fortifications. That's right on the horizon. That should be, sometime this month, and those will be out. They may be out by the time this is up already. And there's a few things I want to bring up. Oak and Iron because we have so much done for that that we haven't been able to make anything. We have full expansions done, whole campaign systems, tons of models, new units, new cards, new factions, but with the current world situation, we don't have a way to make any of it present. Yeah. But that's a big part of the reason for the investment in the equipment is we're going to be able to make that locally now within our own facility. So there's a lot of big stuff coming for Oak and Iron soon. And I think I'll leave it at that for now. Those are the important.
I was going to say, I think that's quite a lot of stuff. So
we've been working.
Yeah, effectively, what you're saying is that if you're playing any of the Firelock Games game range, there is something for you to dive into and have fun with, which is pretty cool.
Absolutely, we have the Blood and Steel expansion. I'm finally cracking down on Rufus to get it finished. So it's looking like he'll be turning it in by the end of the month. I've been looking at his manuscript, and it's finally getting there. So. Brilliant. And I should touch on the Kickstarter as well. So we just did a big update on the shipping for that. So if you back that Kickstarter and you haven't seen the update yet, you're expecting delivery between August and November. Probably in the middle is the reality there. But just with shipping these days, it's impossible to give an accurate date. So I want to at least give that range. But everything is coming out so good, and it's been so much work to get that thing done. So
I'm sure it will be very appreciated. Work, but
it is coming out beautiful, and everything looks great. Everything's being printed right now, and the molds are getting wrapped up. So I'm excited to finally get it out to people. So we're almost there, guys. We're almost there.
Well, thank you very much, Mike, Liam, and Joseph, for chatting to me about Fire on the Frontier. I know there's loads of people that are ready and raring to go and dive into this and have fun with it. As we've discussed, there's loads in this book for you to dive in and play around with. There's some really awesome scenarios, the new rules for fortifications and everything as well. So, yes. Thank you very much, gentlemen. It was really awesome talking to you. Make sure to drop your comments down below, asking some questions about Fire on the Frontier. Maybe we'll be able to give you some answers if you haven't already got them from the video. And yes, it looks like there is loads of amazing things to play around with Blood and Plunder. We'll be back with another video very, very soon. Bye for now.
Go ahead and check out our other content on screen now. And while you're at it, why not hit subscribe and remember to ding our dong. Go on, you know you want to click it. Go on.